also test driving a new streaming platform with it. So hopefully it goes smoothly, and we have a good time here. Let's see if I can get rid of this. Well, yeah, for folks, it's been really wonderful, honestly. In the past, few weeks, we've had a huge influx of new folks. We're really, really happy to have all of y'all joining us, being a part of the Love Reckoning community. So figured might as well introduce myself. Let me just pull this down. I don't know how to get it out of here. So already, there we go. My name is David Griscom. I'm a socialist. I'm a Texan. I do this. I write. I do other things. I'm really happy to still be a part of this community. I've been doing this for a while, and one of the things, in addition to talking about politics and current events with y'all, as many of y'all know, I'm a big fan of Southern labor history. I'm actually writing a book about Texas's socialist history right now. So, in addition to all things going on around the world, I'm always really happy to talk about some of those lessons from our past. These are a little bit more casual than the main show. I like to hang out, take questions from y'all. I'm really happy to talk about a lot of different things. I'll only be as good as these questions are. So, try to think of things that will be fun for all of us to get into. We don't require them. I try to answer all kinds of chats, but we do really appreciate super chats as well. But I know there's a few folks in here, and I know it's been a really long time since I've done one of these. Apologies. Hoping to get more and more into it. It's tough. I mean, other than Left Reckoning putting out this great show for y'all each week, I'm really, really focused on finishing up my book. So I'll try to do these a little bit more frequently, but I can't promise anything. But let's see what we got in here. I see one from Yor. Yor says, how is healthcare not part of culture? All class and political issues are part of culture. Culture is the unique experiences and beliefs shared by people of a similar region or identity. Um, I'm not really certain what you mean by that. I mean, healthcare is like an actually existing thing, right? It's kind of one of those things you either have it or you don't. So I don't know, like, it, you'll have to ask again. I'm sorry, what you mean by that, because it's not particularly clear. I think if you a lot of times people like to bend definitions of things to where they almost become useless, right? So if everything's culture, then everything's culture. Then what does it mean to say that something is a cultural critique or related to this, right? It doesn't really get us very far. So if you get to that to me again, I'll try. Um, Byron Man says, and let's see, I wonder how these are. Man, I'm liking this new platform. What do you think of the DNC chair race? Ben Wickler from Wisconsin looks to be in the lead. Will he be any better? I will tell you right now, he will not. I mean, frankly, I don't see very much going on there, and I think, um, you know, it shows probably everything that you already know. I know, friend, about the Democratic Party, how it's run, who it's run for, just the way that these kind of systems are. Like the Democratic Party chair would be interesting. Let's say if it were actually something like, remember when Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labor Party? They expanded democracy within the Labor Party, and a lot of people showed up and they supported Jeremy Corbyn. It was a huge surprise. And the Democratic Party became more democratic instead of a kind of an elite captured party, right? That's how, think about the way that the Democratic chairs picked, right? And then maybe this would be interesting in a structural way. But no, this just kind of like reaffirms what kind of face they want to put forward. I really just don't find there to be very much to put a lot of stock into the Democratic Party in general, but especially, frankly, in the chair race. Sorry, to pour cold water on that, but it's hard for me to get out of bed for something like that. Okay, so you're asking me a question about, do I think that healthcare is a cultural issue? And they said all systems are cultured by that definition. Racism in the justice system is cultural. The class division in healthcare is cultural. Um, and cross-class problems are cultural. Yeah, I think that they aren't. That they aren't cultural issues. I think looking at the problems in healthcare as cultural issues is probably a good way to distract from the actual fundamental material issues when it comes to healthcare, and that is that we have a for-profit healthcare system, that we have a private healthcare system, that we have a middleman sitting on top of healthcare, right? When you start talking about culture, that's a way that liberals in particular, and conservatives too, right? They just do it in the inverse, want to engage with these questions. In a way that it's kind of unsolvable, right? Because again, if you're talking about something as amorphous as culture, then it's something that you can't even actually address. Therefore, you can spend a lot of energy talking about it, like we've now spent a couple minutes on it, but you won't get to any kind of solution. I might, if you have a finer point on that, I might take it again, but that might be it. Um, Caleb, with a very important message here, says, I can't wait to read that book, David. And I can't wait for you to read it. And I can't wait for other folks to read it. I got to finish writing it. It's going to be a little bit, but we'll see. Um, okay, we got a few here. Here is a question from NG who says, be good to get your take on the Chibber podcast, woke podcast, solidarity from Salford across the Atlantic. Yeah, I mean, I wonder if there's people who have more questions about it or been following it all. It's great. We have Vivek Chibber on the program recently. I listened to the most recent um, episode that he put together with Melissa Nashek, and it was phenomenal. I mean, I highly suggest people go and listen to it if they haven't already. What's truly amazing to see is that Vivek does something that I actually think is very, very difficult, which is actually to take something that is kind of in the ether, is hard to describe, is hard to explain, like quote unquote wokeness, and actually takes it and puts it into a material and historical context, right? Where he sort of places this ideology, particularly it's more authoritarian bent, in the kind of crisis of neoliberalism, and in the retreat of the left into the universities. I think it's a very interesting take on it. I think that there is certainly a lot to learn from it. He made a really great point, and I think that this is probably one of the better definitions that I've ever heard of wokeness. Because again, like wokeness is like something that came out of slang, pop culture. Then it kind of became weaponized as the right, and it's sort of thrown at many different things. So again, it can be hard. It can be hard, to always put a fine point on it. But Vivek, I think, does fairly well actually getting to the root of it, of one of those things that at least we on the left should take seriously, which is that the wokeness is social justice with class taken out, social justice with class taken out. And I think this is really phenomenal and actually gets to a fundamental tension. Why was it, for example, that these kind of movements and critiques coming from the Democratic Party were sort of lobbed against, like, probably the most exciting working class politics movement in the Democratic Party in our lifetime, which was Bernie Sanders, right? Well, it's because wokeness was something that takes the class out of politics, takes the class out of social justice, and is used to kind of weaponize a certain class of people, right, who don't have interest in kind of popular democracy, do not have interest in overtaking or overthrowing capitalism. Because when it comes to things like social justice, and this was one of the points that Bernie made and many other people made at the time, um, you know, that's always been the purview of the left, and specifically the socialist left. In fact, the socialists were far and ahead more advanced than any other kind of political movement in this country in, let's say, the 20th century, on questions of gender, on questions of race, on questions of sexuality. Look at the history of the American Socialist Party, right? I mean, these are people who are organizing all across the country, but let's look at the South, right, where they were doing this kind of work, and they're taking on directly. Um, these kind of systems of white supremacy, alongside the entrenched powers of the bosses and capitalism. Is always perfect? No. I mean, in fact, there's a very long, this would be a big part of my book, for example. There is this kind of give and take where these movements are trying to figure out how they're going to take on these massive systems, if they can compartmentalize these things. And what ends up winning out, or what ends up being proven true by history, is that a system, for example, like racism, is set up to divide working class people so that poor whites and poor blacks are pitted against each other fighting against each other instead of taking on their bosses. And you see chapter after chapter of this in the Southern labor history movement, right? And what ends up winning out, what ends up being effective, is the recognition that these things are actually part of the same struggle. Now, what we've seen in the 2010s, 2020s was an attempt to pull those movements for social justice outside of that broader history, outside of that broader class struggle, which is why they are now battles that are being waged at the top, right? This is why wokeness has moved from being, again, what was sort of meant colloquially, people getting serious about their history, people understanding what is the actual meaning of things, why things are the way they are, why words mean what they do, right? To now being effectively the language of the HR department, of the bosses. Now, what you're seeing right now is a kind of crisis of this ideology of this thing because it was imposed at a time where the ruling ideology of America, the ruling party, the ruling coalition of America was represented by the Democrats. And that was true from 2016 to 2020 and from 2020 to 2024. Right? Because when Trump won that election, right? Remember, he squeaked it by. He won an electoral college victory. He didn't win a popular vote victory. It was a surprise to many people. Most of corporate America lined up behind the Democrats and the opposition to Trump, right? So therefore they also subscribe to the ideology of, again, that ruling party, right, and that ruling class representative, the Democratic Party, in imposing a lot of these kind of things within their own companies and within their own organizations, right? So the class character of these things is absolutely clear to me. And the last point I'll make, and I'm sure just judging from the amount of comments that we've got in the past couple minutes, and I'll try to take them in chronological order. So I'm sure we'll come back to this in a second. The last thing I'll say is this. One, go listen to Vivek Chibber. He's really great. You should be reading Catalyst as well. These are people who are very serious about returning the left to class politics, something that the left had abandoned. People do not remember the fact that before recent memory, right, before 2015, the left, the socialist left, let's call it, was very marginalized, right? You had some resurgence with Occupy, but I think that sometimes the connection between Occupy and Bernie is very exaggerated. But people who want to do class politics, in essence, socialist politics, were very much on the outs. And what has happened in the past few years has been a kind of resurgence to a certain extent, but a lot of people are trying to return back to the old politics that doesn't want to deal with the pesky problem of actually doing working class organizing. Instead, they want to return to kind of critique and to culture and to the academy. We can't play that game anymore. The last point I'll make before we get to some more of the questions here is that if you need a material connection between these like DEI wokeness stuff and like actual material class politics, we talked about it on the main show on Tuesday. I'll talk about it again. Costco. Costco is a massive corporation. Has been long time anti-union, right? But has known how to market themselves very effectively, particularly to liberals, as being a quote unquote good American capitalist company. Well, the Teamsters have been in contract negotiations, and looks like I think they've returned to the bargaining table last that I checked earlier today. But there's a very big potential that there might be a strike announced tomorrow. And you have Al Sharpton and the MSNBC liberals organizing buy-ins at Costco to celebrate the fact that that company has reinstated or defended its corporate DEI programs, right? You want to see how these kind of things are in tension? That like one thing is like the DEI stuff is not actually about liberation. It's not about class power. It's not about undoing hierarchies or anything like that. It's about placating elites in the Democratic Party and in the media, all the while attacking actually working class people. Because as Paul Prescott, our good friend and comrade, noted as well, that if you really care about diversity, the Teamsters is probably, and I would argue definitely, representative of a more diverse part of the American social fabric than the corporate offices of Costco. Anyway, I know I went long on that. I appreciate the question very much, my friend, and always appreciate hearing from our good friends across the Atlantic. So thank you for queuing me up on that. I'm sure we will come back to it. I know there's a lot of people here. As always, folks, love hanging out and taking questions with you. I know it's been a little while, so I'll try to stick with it for a little bit. Um, Byron Mann says, how many catastrophic accidents will occur under Trump, like the DCA coalition, because of his dismantling of the administrative state? I'm sure a lot. I mean, again, this is a smash and grab administration. And there's no doubt about it, that Elon Musk, one of the big things that he wants to gain from this is for there to be less regulation on aviation so he can blow up rockets over South Texas. All right, my friends. We have a good book question. Do we have it released? No, we don't. It's still in the works, but I'll be finishing it up relatively soon. Well, certainly within the first half of the year. So that's all I can really say there. And again, here we go. Switcheroo. Dunk says, as a Texan, what do you think of the prospect of Matthew McConaughey versus John Cornyn in 2026, especially if Harrison Smith from InfoWars primaries went over in the way? I'm not too worried about any InfoWars primaries. I will just say that. I think Cornyn is will have way more serious challengers from the Dunn right here, the religiously funded far right in Texas, which has a huge money cannon that they're ready to shoot at quote unquote rhinos. Um, so that's where you should be looking at if you want to keep up with that race. Uh, Look, I think McConaughey's floated these kind of political runs for a while. Remember, he was going to run against Abbott potentially in the most recent gubernatorial election. He has a very weird political ideology. I think for our movement, like there's a part of it like so you asked me as a Texan. I'll say as a socialist, I think that like we need to just like not get distracted by those kind of things. As a Texan, look, do I think that McConaughey would probably be a little bit better than Cornyn? Sure, but also McConaughey is somebody who you have. There's plenty of reasons to sort of be. Um, Tepid about sort of backing somebody like that because he's somebody who gets like really excited by aphorisms, right? There's somebody who's very inspired by all of these kind of folks like Jordan Peterson, anybody who can sort of talk about self-help stuff, right? He's very much in that world. Could he win? I mean, maybe. I think he would probably have a better shot than a lot of the other kind of boring characters that the Democratic Party puts up here. And he certainly would be able to talk a lot stronger on things like Uvalde, right, than a lot of Democrats are willing to do. But I don't really see it as sort of moving the needle forward too much. Okay. What's up, Gene? Gene's here. Uh, Good to see my friend. Hmm. Well, I think you're wrong, Steve. um, Why didn't Democrats care about mass deportations under Biden? Because, I mean, you already know the answer to it. They're not particularly engaged in these issues outside of their kind of what they believe to be their electoral advantages. I mean, this is what we talk. If you didn't watch our post game, and you can get access to that patreon.com/left reckoning. We had Neil Meyer on to sort of talk about the way that Democrats always like to talk when their backs up to the wall or when they're out of power, which is they start talking big populist in ways that they don't when they're running or governing. And I think it's you can spend a lot of time getting into the psychology of why they might do that, but the reason that they don't support these things when they have the power to change them is because they're not interested in it. Okay, yours says class is cultural because this is so. I'm sorry, this is really wrong. Class is cultural because being poor or worker is part of an identity. What does that mean? Failing to define class as part of culture is why we have lost. Whoa! All right, we got to work here. We got a lot of work to do here. Why we have lost for 40 years, the left isn't even fighting one, but the right is. If one side starts a war and the other doesn't fight back, including a culture war, they become victims. It's why the well is poison on leftism and colloquial conversation. All right, so thesis here is that the left has not been fighting the culture war enough, and that is why we're losing. And also that class is a part of culture. That's why we should care about it. So let's take this one, second part, and then we'll get to the first one. The left has been almost exclusively engaged in culture war for the past 40 years. This has been like the fundamental shift on the left ever since the dawn of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism completely defanged the left. How let's without even talking about like random like debates or pieces. Let's look at the way that like the the major the developments in like left wing thought in the past 40 years, right? You see this massive move away from economics and history and political theory into cultural critique. Right, this is what goes on in the universities. Right, you see this kind of fix it. You see these attempts to redefine Marxism. Right, the problem with Marx is that Marx didn't consider class enough. Marx didn't consider gender enough. Right, these are the major critiques that begin in the 70s, become dominant in the 80s and 90s, to then such an extent where actually talking about class in an academic setting becomes almost taboo, right? I mean, this is what happens with left intellectuals in this country. And then what happens on the political scene? Well, what happens on the political scene is you see a political party, the major left political party, the Democrats, right, which were never really a working class party, but because of FDR, because of the victories that came from his coalition, are sort of seen, at least, if not the party of the working class, the party of organized labor. Well, what do you see from the 70s onward is a turning of the backs of the Democratic Party to those labor leaders, right? You see them start to chase after the folks that they lost to Reagan. You see, obviously, Bill Clinton probably being one of the better embodiments of this kind of new way of talking culture over class, right? I mean, Bill Clinton's I mean, in a lot of ways, is the embodiment of this, right? Because Bill Clinton has a great class story to tell, right? Bill Clinton, I'm a poor working class kid from Arkansas. My family has all these kind of issues. I worked hard and I got ahead and I went to a fancy college and now I'll be the next president of these United States of America, right? Plenty of culture if you want to talk about culture and class, right? Class culture, right? And then materially, what does he do? He wages war on the welfare state. He protects American industry and big business, and he puts the final blow on the American working class with NAFTA, right? So we get all this culture talk from Bill Clinton and this complete retreat from class. I mean, perfect embodiment. So historically, I mean, it's just wrong to sit here and say that the Democrats and the left haven't been engaging in culture war. I mean, that is what they embody. That is what they drank that and it became their blood. The second part, class is cultural. What does that mean? No, 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 no. No, because this is how you get into stupid shit like thinking that John Fetterman is working class. John Fetterman's not working class. He's the son of the elite. He went to fancy school. He dresses like shit. And people say, oh, that's what working class people do. They dress badly, right? Okay, now look at what this guy is doing in government, aligning with the right, aligning against working class people, right? So no, no, class isn't culture. Class is a specific material relation of people who have to work in order to survive, right? Because they do not own the means of production, or maybe a better way to put this, a more accessible way to put this is they have to work for a wage because they don't get capital gains, because they don't own assets. They have to get a wage, which they then take, and then they have to use that to pay for their rent, pay for their food, pay for their water bill, all those things that are necessary in order to keep on surviving, right? Now, that's what they do outside of work, right? With the wage that they take home. At work, they produce things, they create things, they produce value at work for their boss. That's why their boss hires them, because they want them to work for them, produce value, and to enrich the boss. The worker goes to work and they produce more value for the boss, right? For the company than they take home, right? Because their wage is only because it wouldn't make sense, right? They wouldn't be able, the company wouldn't survive because they have to have a parasitic class on the top that gets the vast majority of the value that's created at work, right? While the actual people producing that value get a pittance, a very small portion of it that usually they finish in an hour or so every day at work of creating that value, and then the rest of it is all just labor that is value that is being created for the benefit of the boss, for the benefit of the company. That is a distinct material economic relation, right? It doesn't matter what the culture, right? What kind of music the worker listens to. What I mean, you could be a worker who listens to classical music, and your boss can listen to country, right? Does that make a difference? No, right? And this is a really bad way of thinking about politics. That comes again from the really bad way that many people are taught to think about history, to think about politics, to think about economics. That come from the universities, from the education system in America, which has had a concerted effort to deny and relegate these stronger understandings of economics and class politics, right? Very, very dangerous thing that we have to break out of if we're serious about changing anything. Because this endless, endless fixation on culture and culture politics is just walking deeper and deeper and deeper into the grave of history. Okay, I know we got a bunch of stuff here. I guess this means I should be doing these more often. Um, David said, "My fear with anti-wokeness stuff is people might take the wrong lessons from it. So instead of being able to distinguish corporate smoke screens versus what Trump is doing, well, the answer is simple. Then this is why we should be the ones making these critiques, right? I mean, if you don't, then you just allow the right to define it. This is something that Chibber literally says in this thing that kind of made a lot of people mad. Is that hey, if the left, the socialists, let's call them, say, oh, we're not going to critique the ideology of the bosses. We're not going to critique the ideology of the corporation, lest the working class become confused by all of the critiques that we're making. Well, then you end up one doing this really condescending thing that a lot of leftists do, where they say, "Oh, people are too dumb to understand the world, so we have to talk in secret and in code and in an implication." I'm not saying you're saying this, but I'm just like this is like something that people always bring up. It's like, "Oh, we can if we call it a secret thing, then everybody won't have any like ideological baggage around this, right?" Well, what you're saying is like we want to lie to people, and like anything, friends, sorry, if you start relationships with people by lying to them, it's going to be very, very hard if you're ever going to be able to gain their trust once they realize that you have been lying or misleading them. But the other thing, and the larger point is, it means that if you're frustrated with what you're experiencing with, some of these like ruling class ideas, and you're like, oh, I want some arguments against them, right? And the only people who are providing that to you is the right because the left doesn't is incapable of standing up and articulating these kind of things. Well, then what happens to anybody who experiences tension over these kind of ideas? Well, the only ones who want to speak to them are the right, and this is kind of what we have seen as we have again seen a massive shift amongst working class voters to the right. And I think I agree with this. I have to read it closer, but I think Ian says wokeness, anti-wokeness is a material struggle within the middle class for jobs within the PMC. I think this is fair. The more baroque and complex wokeness got, the better it appears as morality, but it is material. Um, yeah, I think that it is something that is material, both in where it came from and what the stakes of this debate can mean. Yeah. I know I didn't want to. I know I didn't say this at the beginning, but we have enough people here now that it really is going to help me if y'all do at Left Reckoning in the chat for me to be able to keep up with it. Um, and Jonathan Scott, and we appreciate the super chat too. says, I can't believe that ChatGPT lost its job to AI. I know it is. The irony is pretty beautiful. Um, that this that they're complaining. It's like, oh my God, this thing has just been scraping information without permission from us. I was like, okay, is that the thing that y'all invented? Um, okay, let me see. There's plenty of questions here. I'm trying to distinguish between cues and just people chatting, which I'm happy for y'all to be hanging out. Um, Chris says, I haven't watched much recently, and I've been trying to take a mental break. No, no, very fair there. Apologies if the question is redundant, repetitive. Thoughts on current global tensions other than bad? Yeah, I mean, I think that Joe Biden really left the world in a terrible state, and what we're going to get is a lot of kind of strongman Trump, and I don't think that that makes for a more stable or safe world. Um, I think that there's going to be some shifts from it. I think that one thing that Matt and I really want to do more of is we want to cover Bukele more. I think we want to do a lot of stuff on Argentina as well. Um, but Bukele being somebody who you know seems to be well, I mean, he is like now, according to like global like opinion polls, is like one of the most popular global leaders, right? I think that's a very, very worrying and dangerous thing. So I think we're just trying to think about the best way because I think it'll probably be a long, focused episode instead of just sort of like what happened this week. Um, but that's something that I'm watching on the global level. Jen Gengel, sorry. MT says, can I suggest you invite John the Duncan on the show? I don't know them off the top of my head. I'll look into it. Okay. Um, That boy says, what does leftist anti-wokeness look like? What is the leftist critique of, say, Malcolm X or Medgar Evers? Well, let's get to the first bit. I mean, first of all, I would say retroactively, like whatever critiques, for example, could be made of like a Malcolm X, let's say, I wouldn't categorize them in some kind of woke versus anti-woke framing, right? I think that there's a very particular way phenomenon, right? Because again, like I mean, this is why I think people should listen to the Chibber episode on Jacobin Radio. Um, on wokeness because Chibber actually is able to sort of take this and place it in its historical context instead of this weird thing where like wokeness just is now sort of like any kind of conception of race and gender and sexuality in society and politics. That's not what wokeness is, right? Um, so what does leftist anti-wokeness look like? Look, let me talk about something really quick. This is a great example of it. So I think the way that Vivek Chibber talks about wokeness, I think, is actually a very good way to view it. Wokeness is social justice with class pulled out, right? With class taken out. And again, like, look, we've done a lot on this program. You look at some of these things. Again, these aren't like quote unquote woke, but you see where this like is starting to bubble up in the left, at least in the academic left. Look at like a book like Hegemony and Social Strategy by Laclau Mouffe, right? Where we've had Lillian Churchian on this program and have critiqued that book every which way. Go watch those videos if you're curious of those kind of debates, right? But basically, they try to take Marxism out of Marxism, right, or take class out of Marxism, to sort of turn Marxism instead of like a theory of the proletarian, the working class overthrowing the capitalist class. It becomes this much more vague. The marginalized in society will sort of create a constellation of struggles to take over hegemony, the ruling hegemony, right? And the ruling hegemony could be all kinds of things, right? I mean, ostensibly, the ruling hegemony could be in a different universe, right? A proletarian democracy, a working class democracy, because that's the rulers and who are the marginalized there, right? Right? It creates this weird moralism about the way that we view a kind of history and struggle in society. Where a return to Marxism, so the point is to not engage in wokeism versus anti-wokeism, right? That's the point. That's the terrain of the Democrats and the Republicans, right? Or more importantly, the media figures of the Democrats, along with like a certain class of HR, certain class of management, and then on the right, it's right wing media, along with angry parents who want to control their kids' education, ideologues who want to limit speech on campus on against Israel, all that kind of stuff, right? That is a bad framing and a kind of false fight. And what the socialist argument would be like, we need to return to the conversations about class struggle, which are going to include in them like a fight against imperialism, right? A fight for democracy, free speech, an absolutely critical cornerstone of the socialist movement, right? You go back to the Socialist Party. Let's talk about the Socialist Party in Texas, right, which was one of the largest in the country. Once the plantation bosses, once the lumber bosses, once the cattle barons, and the Democrats, who was the ruling class party at that time, decided that they wanted to smash the ability of the Socialist Party. What did they do? They tried to limit the ability of the Socialist Party to produce newspapers and information, right? So just going back to the historical example, the fight for free speech has always been a part of the class struggle of the left. And what the idea is with this is that go back to actual class struggle, go back to actually existing fights and struggles in people's everyday life, instead of a kind of shadow boxing between two portions of the ruling class, be they the Republicans and the Democrats, right? So the, the talking about these things as if they're kind of trans-historical ideologies is wrong, right? This whole thing, the reason that the word's so goofy, right, and it's kind of almost laughable to have to say multiple times, is because it's a very, very particular moment in American political history, right? But it's also a way, and it's also been a kind of sloppy attempt to gum up the actual fights that we need to be engaging in with culture politics, with identity politics, instead of with class politics. Now, going back to what I was getting at the very beginning, look at this. A good way to look about to understand like wokeism, right, as an ideology, and why I think it's Vivek Chibber says so clearly that it is um, um, social justice politics, which again the socialist movement has always been engaged in. In fact, they have been the leaders of from the get-go, to social justice politics with class taken out. Look at the really sloppy way that they tried to reinsert class back into this ideology, right? Because again, as this became more and more hegemonic on the left, there were people who came out of socialist movements, or I think genuinely wanted to still engage with these kind of movements, or thought of themselves as members of the socialist tradition. Said, "Oh, you know what? In this matrix of identities and struggles and bigotries, etc., that we're seeing, we're missing class, right? Okay, fair critique. But because this this critique, right, the critique of American society from wokeism is fundamentally a cultural one, what, right? It's like who is included, who is not included, who's speaking, who is not speaking. Um, the only way that you could reinsert class into it was as if class is the way that class experience in America, the way that it's experienced is as a form of bigotry instead of a form of exploitation. So what do I mean by that? That ugly and analytically just useless term of classism, right? What is classism? Well, classism is prejudging somebody, having prejudice against somebody because of their supposed class position. And how do you judge that? Oh, well, it's not what kind of job that they have, though that might be included, but it can also be what kind of car they drive, what kind of clothes they wear, how they speak, what kind of food they like, right? Okay, well, now instead of class being understood as a very particular material relation, right? A worker, somebody who has to work for a living, who produces value that is then exploited by the boss, right? Expropriated by the boss. It then becomes a kind of cultural it becomes a cultural signifier. So again, going back to John Fetterman, John Fetterman is a working class person because he wears Carhartt and dresses like a moron, right? Okay. Um, should he be allowed to go into? Should he be allowed to go into Congress and not have to wear a tie? These aren't the fights of the working class in America in 2025. Whether or not a fucking senator can dress a certain way in the Senate, right? But if you accept a way of looking at class in America, that is purely cultural, right? That woke version, that classism version, that identity politics version, whatever framework you want to put on it, right? But one that is primarily cultural, right? And that views the problem with class society in America, not the exploitation of value, right? Sorry, the expropriation of value by the capitalist class from the working class, right? But rather the way that people are treated in polite society, right? Again, it always returns to this kind of cocktail party politics, right? How are people being addressed? All this kind of stuff, which again should show you why these kind of politics are not politics of liberation, right? Or social movements in a real way, but were rather things that were produced by people in a very particular social milieu, particularly people in the professional class, but also explicitly and especially folks in academia, right? Where pedigree is everything, right? Title is everything. Um, you see that this kind of politics, instead of again being material, class based, all this other kind of stuff, it becomes purely kind of cultural and whether or not some people are experiencing this or that, right? And the point is not to say that like, oh, there's. Uh, I don't even want to go down that rabbit hole of this kind of thing that people are always kind of forced to do, where you're saying like, oh, if you sort of deny this politics of the elite, then you're saying that like America is some kind of racial utopia. No, we're saying the opposite is true. But the reason that this stuff happens is because of the economic foundations of American society, which have created all forms of different kinds of bigotry and division, hatred, pain, and suffering, right? Um, so you see the way that class critique was sort of kind of sloppily reinserted back into this, and you can see how this was an ideology again, as Vivek Chibber I think excellently put it, that was trying to do social justice with the class taken out. The problem is you really can't do that. You really can't do that if actually achieving liberation, democracy, and freedom for exploited peoples in America is your goal. You can't do that if you don't address the engine of exploitation in America, which has been capitalism. All right, let's see. Um, Damn, I have like 200 messages, and I don't know if I'm gonna be able to get to them all. I'm gonna kind of go at random. If I'm gonna look predominantly, um, Sassy says when people lean hard into the idea of anti-woke, they just come off as racist, which is going to scare people away. Yeah, well, I don't think, as I've said multiple times, I don't think that I think that that is the kind of the terrain of the right. I think that where people fall into this mistake is thinking that because the right does something, that the left should therefore spend a lot of their time again defending like HR corporate policies in America. That's bizarre. That's silly, right? That's not taking our task as socialists seriously. Um, I totally agree. You know, Rebranding as anti woke is moronic, along with odious. I think that engaging and actually applying one of those labels to yourself directly, um, is fairly misguided. Okay, right. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get in here with some questions here. Or maybe I've just dropped so many mics over here that we don't know how to, we don't know where to go next. Okay. Yours says we do not have to choose between economic populism and social justice. Who said that you do? Either I'm failing to follow, yes, you are, or I'm going to disagree with your analysis. Okay. Um, People directly see the material interest as tied to their identity. Again, this kind of fixation on identity is wrong-headed. You can't change people thinking of their interests without changing what they think matters most. What? I mean, it seems like you're confused by the end of your question here. People directly see the material interest as tied to their identity. You can't change people thinking of their interests without changing what they think matters most. What? Um, so the the point about understanding like interests, right, is that we all have, yeah, as you're saying correctly, a whole host of identities, right? Um, I'm a socialist. I'm a Texan. I'm a man. I'm a barbecue enthusiast. I like Waylon Jennings. I have lots of different identities, right? Um, but what does kind of transcend these things and what allows me to have solidarity with maybe somebody who likes, I don't know, like Morgan Wallen or something silly like that, might be something like a shared class interest, right? And that class interest being something like universal healthcare, right? It's a difficult, stressful thing in my life. It's probably a difficult, stressful thing for their life as well, right? These are the kind of things that are very unifying, right? And this kind of fixation with fragmentation that the left took in the 70s, again, was theoretically wrong. Um, because it starts to create these ways of viewing the world, ways of viewing all of these constructed identities that we have as kind of coming from God, right? Like these things that are sort of placed inside of us, instead of things that have been created through history, through like by human beings for a certain kind of social and predominantly economic reasons. So the class critique or the kind of class focus of politics is that there are way more working class people, just bar none, on the planet than there are ruling class members of society. And class actually ends up being a very unifying force in terms of creating shared common interests, which are the kind of things you need for politics. Um, so this is why people engage in class politics, right? This is why this is supposedly the engine of political and social change. Is that this is something that is very unifying for folks, and it's really wild. I mean, it is so wild to see how these things developed over time because it is a very modern thing, a kind of hyper focus on identity like this, at least especially for the left. I mean, you look at. I mean, I've been. This is a really great book here called "Grassroots Socialism: Radical Movements in the Southwest." And a lot of people wouldn't know this, but you know what parts of the country had the strongest Socialist Party movement in the U.S.? Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, right? And they were engaging with people of all different kinds of quote unquote, as you would like to call it, identities. But what they were able to do was to engage people of all of these different identities. And I mean, Lord, at a time when those things were felt in a kind of visceral way, right? I mean, hell, not only dealing with segregation and all that kind of deprivation, but the living memory of slavery, right? People living in towns that's might have been created um, to maintain like a slave system, right? So that's a very visceral thing. But you know the difference in the way that people talk about stuff versus then versus now is while there's like a lot of focus right now is sort of looking um, at yourself in a way that's like, I can be from this group, and I can be sort of seen um, as somebody who's been marginalized or harmed, right? Be it visibly and also sometimes invisibly, as people say, right? And that's the kind of thing that is like currency on the left, right? It's a big thing, big deal for a lot of folks. Um, you read this stuff, you read the way that people are talking about the future there. And these are like tenant farmers, right? These are people who have literally nothing, like probably not even shoes, right? And they're saying things like, I am going to be the one, right? We are going to be the ones who create the cooperative commonwealth, right? Who create this new future, right? This new society, right? This new, maybe even paradise on earth, right? Very optimistic, very much about action and engagement and movement. It's just the complete opposite, I think, of the way that a lot of folks sort of view themselves today, right? All these people had identities, but that didn't come into um, that wasn't something that kind of was preventing people, um, especially at least the smart ones, um, from kind of engaging in these kind of positive, broader, focused politics versus one of kind of recognition, right? This is another thing that's very important, I think, to modern leftists that it would have been completely bamboozling to the old socialists, which is like this kind of fixation on recognition. Am I recognized for what I've gone through? Well, what's more important than being recognized probably is like winning power and like winning a better life. And I think there is like a kind of defeatism. Um, is that like, oh, maybe we won't be successful, but I will sort of be seen and remembered as a good one, right? And I think that you look at the difficulty of like leftists to sort of expand after you saw this kind of this fertile ground for a little while. Um, does sort of have to do a lot with the fact that like a lot of people aren't really engaging with politics to win, let's say, the cooperative commonwealth, to use like their terminology, or hell, even moderate things like Medicare for all, right? Those things have fallen almost to the wayside on the way the law left talk about politics. It's a lot of like, have I been seen? Have I been heard? Have I been recognized? And that's a different kind of politics. I think that's not a politics that's actually engaged in winning. Yeah, it might feel kind of emotionally important. Um, but having an emotional feeling of feeling recognized and seen is a very different thing from winning political power. All right, I think this is a hard one to do at this point. Um, Me to y'all. Let's see, because there's a lot of messages here. All right. I think at this point, I think that there's people who are seriously engaging. I think there's a lot of people who aren't aren't interested or aren't coming into the conversation from the same kind of place or background. Um, I think we have a lot of chats that I might be missing. These are fun though. I mean, again, I think I think that this shows that we should be doing a little bit more of this. Yeah, I think at this point I apologize, but I feel like I'm like way behind on the chat. I think, um, and I don't know if I'll be able to catch up. I appreciate, and plus we've been going for an hour. I appreciate all of y'all. We're happy. I'm happy to do these again as always. Hopefully, it will take some time. Again, I'm really focused on finishing up this book, but I do like these, even though it's sometimes difficult. I wish to try to figure out a way to do this where people can maybe call in because it's kind of hard sometimes to do it solo. But regardless, I appreciate all of y'all. Thank you for tuning in. I see that our good friend Dave from Jamaica got their Left Reckoning shirt. I'm really happy to hear that, my friend. Appreciate all of y'all. We'll be back this Sunday with a bonus episode. You get those at patreon.com/Left Reckoning. Go watch the Grace Blakely and Asal Rod interview if you missed the main show on Tuesday. Asal Rod is a must follow if you're serious about Palestine and pushing back against false media narratives. She's phenomenal. And Grace Blakely just writes and speaks in such a great, accessible way and is a real great old school socialist. I appreciate that a lot about her. Her new book, Vulture Capitalism, is great. Those are up now on the main feed and the podcast. You can get them in a lot of different places. But without that, folks, I got to run. I appreciate y'all and see you soon. Oh, man. There we go. Well, I guess that's not going to work. But all right, I'm just going to do a hard stop. See y'all later. Bye.